22 years ago, after the tragic loss of his wife, the millionaire was frozen when he met the gaze of the waitress. Hello, welcome. Enjoy, subscribe, and activate notifications. During a dinner at a seaside restaurant, billionaire Alfred Wilson was paralyzed upon realizing that the waitress serving them bore an astonishing resemblance to his late wife, who had passed away 20 years prior. Alfred, seated at a secluded table in the corner of Los Angeles's most exclusive restaurant, was distracted by the storm outside. Raindrops tapped against the large glass windows, creating a melody that blended with the soft murmur of surrounding conversations. He glanced at the menu, but his thoughts were elsewhere, haunted by a past he preferred to avoid. 2 decades had passed since the tragic loss of his great love, and Alfred had never been the same. However, that night, something was about to change. When he looked up, his eyes fixed on one of the waitresses crossing the dining room. For a moment, he could barely breathe, and his hand nearly lost control of the utensils. The young woman, moving gracefully between tables, had a face he would recognize anywhere, even after 20 years. It was as if Aurora, his late wife, had returned from the grave to haunt him. She had the same eyes, the same delicate smile, and even her way of walking evoked that of his deceased wife. Alfred's heart raced, and, without realizing it, he called a waiter over. "That waitress over there, what's her name?" he asked, discreetly pointing. The waiter, surprised by the question, quickly replied, "Oh, that's Helen, sir. She started working here a few months ago." The name meant nothing to Alfred, but he couldn't take his eyes off her. His mind was filled with questions and memories, and before he could stop himself, he called Helen over to his table. She approached with a polite smile, though she seemed slightly confused by the situation. "Good evening, sir. How can I help you?" Her voice was soft, and a chill ran down Alfred's spine. "Yes, I just wanted to ask you something. Your name is Helen, right?" Alfred tried to maintain his composure, but his voice betrayed his anxiety. Helen raised an eyebrow, surprised by the strange question. "Yes, my name is Helen. Is there a problem, sir?" She looked around, perhaps trying to figure out if she had made a mistake. "No, not at all. It's just that you remind me of someone I met many years ago," he said, pausing and taking a deep breath before continuing. "Have you been working here long?" She shook her head. "Not long. I've always had jobs like this, you know. I never had many options. I grew up in an orphanage and never met my biological parents, so I always had to fend for myself." Those words hit Alfred like a punch to the gut. An orphanage. The idea that she could be his long-lost daughter, the baby Aurora had been carrying when she disappeared, left him stunned. Alfred masked his emotions as best he could and tried to continue the conversation casually. "I see. It must have been hard growing up without a family," he commented, feeling an overwhelming connection to Helen's story. She shrugged, as if the reality of her life was nothing new. "It is, but you get used to it, I guess. It's part of life," she smiled, though there was a hidden sadness in her eyes. Alfred observed her for a moment, trying to understand what was going through the young woman's mind. From that moment, he knew his life would never be the same again. When she moved away to attend to another table, Alfred felt something long dormant within him beginning to awaken, a hope, a remote possibility he had never dared imagine. What if Helen was indeed his daughter? What if fate was giving him a chance to reclaim what he had lost so long ago? Alfred spent the rest of the dinner in silence, barely touching his food. The rain outside seemed to reflect the tumult of thoughts overwhelming his mind. When he finished his meal, he knew he needed to learn more about Helen, to understand who this young woman was who had appeared in his life like a shadow of Aurora. As he left the restaurant, Alfred cast one last glance at Helen, who moved elegantly between tables. He still didn't know what he would do next, but he was certain of one thing: that encounter had not been by chance. Something greater was at play, something he needed to uncover, even if it meant reopening wounds that had yet to heal. Back at home, Alfred sat in his favorite armchair, looking out the window at the rain's reflection still falling. He wondered how it was possible for a young woman like Helen to appear in Los Angeles, the same city where Aurora had disappeared years ago. Was it merely a coincidence or a sign of destiny? With his mind full of doubts, he pulled an old photo of Aurora from his wallet and mentally compared it with the fresh image of Helen in his memory. The resemblance was undeniable, but so were the doubts. Before going to bed, Alfred decided that he would return to the restaurant in the coming days, hoping to find more clues about Helen's life. He knew he had to be cautious, he didn't want to frighten her with his suspicions, but deep within, a voice whispered that he was on the right track and that this was his chance to finally understand what had truly happened in the past. That night, Alfred slept poorly, tormented by dreams in which he saw Aurora smiling at him while a dark shadow took her away. He woke up in a sweat, with Helen's name on his lips, feeling that a new chapter in his life had begun, and he was willing to do whatever it took to reach the end of that story. The days following his encounter with Helen were filled with restless anticipation for Alfred. He couldn't get the young woman out of his mind, and every detail of their first meeting replayed like a film in his memory. He returned to the restaurant several nights, always looking for opportunities to speak with her without seeming too insistent. Helen, for her part, remained cordial and professional, but noticed there was something different about the customer who constantly asked questions about her life. One of those nights, when the restaurant was quieter and Helen had a moment to rest, Alfred called her over to his table again. This time, he decided to be more direct, though without revealing his true motivations. "Helen, I've been thinking. Have you ever considered leaving this job and trying something different?" He observed her closely, searching for any hint in her expression. She frowned, surprised by the question. "Something different?" "Look, Mr. Alfred, I appreciate your concern, but I need this job. It helps me pay the rent and bills." "I don't have many options," Helen said, a bit uncomfortable, as if trying to understand why such an elegant and successful man was interested in her life. Alfred gave her a sympathetic smile and leaned back in his chair, crossing his hands. "I understand, but I'm talking about a better opportunity. I would like to offer you a job as my personal assistant. Of course, it's a different type of work than what you do here, and it would guarantee you a much higher salary, as well as benefits." The offer took Helen by surprise. She paused for a few seconds, trying to digest his words. "Personal assistant? But, why me? I have no experience in that type of work, and you barely know me," she responded with a mix of confusion and caution. Alfred leaned slightly forward, trying to convey sincerity. "I see potential in you, Helen, and maybe you need an opportunity to change your life. I promise that if you accept, you will have all the support necessary to learn and grow in this position. And I need someone I can trust, someone to help me with daily tasks." He avoided mentioning the true reasons behind his interest, but every word he spoke carried a hidden truth. Helen looked at him, still trying to understand what motivated this man to offer her such an unexpected opportunity. "Thank you very much, but it's an important decision. I need to think it over," she said, clearly unsettled. Alfred, respecting her time, nodded softly. "Of course, I understand. Take your time, and when you have an answer, you can contact me. I really believe this could be a big change for you," he said, trying to seem relaxed despite the anxiety consuming him. That night, Helen returned to her small apartment with her mind full of thoughts. While preparing a simple dinner, she tried to imagine what her life would be like if she accepted Alfred's offer. The proposal seemed too good to be true, and she wondered why someone like him, an important businessman, would be interested in helping her. On the other hand, the prospect of a better life, away from the difficulties she had always faced, was too tempting to ignore. In the following days, Alfred remained patient, though the anticipation consumed him inside. Every time his phone rang, he hoped to hear Helen's voice, hoping she had decided to accept the offer. He tried to concentrate on his work, but his mind kept returning to the possibility that Helen could be his daughter. Finally, A week after their conversation at the restaurant, Helen decided to call Alfred. On the other end of the line, he heard her voice, a little hesitant. "Mr. Alfred, I've thought a lot about your offer and, well, I'd like to accept. I suppose I have nothing to lose by trying something new." Alfred's relief was palpable. "You won't regret it, Helen. I promise I'll do everything possible to make you feel comfortable and help you learn what you need. Tomorrow, we can talk more about the job details and start organizing everything for your new role." After hanging up, Alfred felt a mixture of anxiety and hope. He knew this was only the first step in a journey that could change both of their lives. Now that Helen had agreed to work by his side, he would have more opportunities to get closer and uncover the truth about her origins without raising suspicion. But he also feared that his expectations would crumble, that it was all just a desperate illusion to fill the void left by Aurora. The following day, Alfred received Helen in his office for the first time. She was visibly nervous, dressed in simple but neat clothes, a stark contrast to her waitress uniform. He welcomed her with a reassuring smile and showed her the space where they would work together. He explained the basic tasks she would need to perform as his assistant and made it clear that she would have time to adapt. Helen looked around with, "All this is very different from what I'm used to. Thank you for trusting me, Mr. Alfred." "I really hope to meet your expectations," Helen said, feeling a bit more relaxed. "I know, Helen, and please, just call me Alfred. We're starting a new chapter, right?" He replied, trying to keep the tone light, though he couldn't help but feel that something much bigger was at stake. Helen smiled, a little more at ease. "Then I think we'll get along well. I'm ready to learn." As she explored her new environment, Alfred allowed himself a brief moment of contemplation. Seeing her there, in his office, beside him, rekindled a spark of hope in his heart. Perhaps, just perhaps, he was closer to unraveling the mystery that had tormented him for so long, and he was willing to do whatever it took. The first few days of Helen working as Alfred's personal assistant were marked by a mix of nervousness and anticipation, for both of them. Everything was new to her, from the sophisticated office environment to the responsibilities she had taken on. Alfred, for his part, observed her closely, always searching for traits that might confirm his suspicion that Helen was, in fact, his lost daughter. But beyond the questions filling his mind, he couldn't help but feel a growing affection for the young woman who, unknowingly, seemed to bring a bit of light to his lonely life. One morning, while Alfred was in the office and Helen was organizing some documents, he was struck by a wave of nostalgia upon finding an old photo of Aurora in a drawer. She was smiling, holding a flower, and the image made his chest tighten. Feeling the need to share a part of his past, he called Helen into his office. "Helen, sit here for a moment. I'd like to tell you about someone very important to me," he said, holding the photo of Aurora, his expression a mix of longing and pain. Helen, unsure of what to expect, sat in the chair in front of Alfred's desk, observing his distant expression. She noticed the photograph in his hands, and for a moment, something within her seemed to recognize that face, but the feeling was quickly replaced by curiosity. "This is Aurora, my wife. She passed away 20 years ago in an accident," Alfred said, pausing as if the words were still difficult to say. "She was the most important person in my life. Losing her was like losing a part of myself. And, you know, for some reason, when I first saw you, you reminded me so much of her." Helen listened in silence, feeling strangely moved by this man's pain. There was something in his story that touched her in a way she couldn't explain. "I'm very sorry, Alfred. It must have been incredibly hard to lose someone you loved so much," she said softly. He nodded, swallowing hard. "It was. But, somehow, it brought me here, to this moment, meeting you. Some memories have returned stronger than ever." He looked at the photo once more before putting it away, trying to hide the emotion that threatened to overflow. Helen remained silent for a moment, feeling the weight of Alfred's words. She didn't know why he was telling her all this, but the sincerity in his voice moved her deeply. "Thank you for trusting me enough to share this, Alfred. I promise I'll do my best not to let you down here," she said. Alfred smiled, trying to lighten the heavy atmosphere. "I know you will, Helen. I'm sure of it." But inside, that conversation only strengthened his determination to uncover the truth about her. At the same time, it made him question how much he was willing to risk and how much he might hurt Helen with the secrets of the past. In the weeks that followed, Alfred began to delve deeper into Aurora's files, reviewing old documents he had kept as a way of preserving her memory. During this process, he found a letter he had never read before. It was tucked inside one of the books Aurora used to read. The words were laden with despair and fear, as if she had known that something terrible was about to happen. "Dear, if something happens to me, please take care of our baby. I'm afraid, I feel that something is wrong, and I need you to stay vigilant. I no longer trust him as I used to." The word "him" made Alfred's heart race. He remembered his brother-in-law as someone who was always present but distant, and it had never occurred to him that he could be a threat. Now, rereading Aurora's words, he wondered if he had been too naive in trusting him. Alfred read the letter several times, feeling his anguish grow. It was as if he had lost his wife twice, the woman he loved and the opportunity to protect her. The weight of regret fell heavily on his shoulders, and he blamed himself for not noticing the signs sooner. He thought of Helen, who was in the next room, completely unaware of the storm that was about to break. The distrust he felt toward his brother-in-law turned into a silent obsession for Alfred. He began to recall Aurora's last days, the meetings she had with her brother, the conversations that would stop when he entered the room. At the time, he hadn't given it much thought, but now, every detail seemed to be a piece of a much larger puzzle. While Alfred dealt with these discoveries, Helen also felt that something was changing. She noticed that Alfred was becoming more thoughtful, immersed in deep reflection. He treated her with a kindness she had never experienced before, and although she didn't fully understand the reasons behind it, she began to see Alfred as a father figure, someone who seemed to genuinely care about her well-being. One afternoon, while organizing documents for Alfred, Helen found an old photo of Aurora with a man she didn't recognize. Driven by curiosity, she showed the image to Alfred, who nearly dropped the papers when he realized what she had in her hands. "Who is this next to your wife?" Helen asked, pointing to the man standing beside Aurora. Alfred hesitated for a moment before responding, trying to keep his voice steady. "That's him, the brother-in-law. We were very close until things changed." Helen noticed the hesitation in his voice but decided not to press him. "Do you not speak anymore?" she asked, trying to understand the story that seemed shrouded in silence and mystery. "No. We grew apart after Aurora's death." "He went down a very different path than mine," Alfred replied, looking away. Helen sensed there was something unspoken in Alfred's words, but she respected his silence. Inside, Alfred knew he couldn't keep these secrets much longer. Every day he spent with Helen, the urgency to uncover the truth intensified, and he felt that he was getting closer to a revelation that would change their lives forever. Helen was slowly adapting to her new routine as Alfred's personal assistant, though she still felt out of place in the luxurious office environment. However, she began to realize that this change could be an opportunity to transform her life. For his part, Alfred continued to observe her closely, hoping that some gesture, some look, might reveal Helen's true identity. Days at the office took on a new rhythm. Alfred dedicated himself to teaching Helen about the tasks she would need to perform, from organizing the meeting schedule to understanding the details of the family business. He made sure to guide her every step of the way. Little by little, she adapted and grew more confident in her duties. Helen noticed that Alfred was much more than the serious and reserved man he appeared to be. There was a kind and attentive side that he revealed in small gestures, like bringing her coffee or praising her work when it was well done. "You're doing an excellent job, Helen," Alfred told her one day after she organized an important presentation for one of the clients. "I'm impressed by how well you've adapted. She smiled, surprised by the compliment. Thank you, Alfred. I never thought I could fit into an environment like this, but I'm enjoying the challenge. I knew you could, he replied, looking at her with a sparkle in his eyes. The pride he felt for her was genuine, and more than ever, Alfred wished his instincts were right. He found himself imagining what his life would be like if Helen really were his daughter, if he could give her the support he had never had the chance to offer. Over time, the formality between them gave way to a more natural closeness. Alfred began to share stories from his youth, the trips he took with Aurora, the things they enjoyed doing together. Helen listened intently, often moved by Alfred's memories. She had never known her biological parents but had always imagined what it would be like to have a family, someone who cared for her the way Alfred seemed to. You miss her, don't you? Helen asked one day as they organized old files in Alfred's office. He looked at her, surprised by the question, but couldn't help giving a sad smile. I do. Every day since she left. But somehow, her memories are what keep me going. Even if they hurt, they remind me of who I am and what I've lived through. Alfred sighed, looking at a picture frame on his desk that held a photo of Aurora smiling. Have you ever wondered about your parents, Helen? About who they were? Alfred asked, his tone more serious. Helen was silent for a moment, thinking about how to answer. Yes, many times. I used to wonder if they were good people, if they had to leave me for a special reason, or if they simply didn't want to stay with me. But I try not to think about it much, you know. It's easier to accept that I may never know the truth. Alfred felt a knot in his chest upon hearing those words. The desire to share his suspicions with her was strong, but he knew it wasn't the time yet. He needed to be sure first. He didn't want to destroy Helen's hopes with an uncertain possibility. As their bond strengthened, Alfred also intensified his investigation into Helen's past. He gathered documents from old clinics and orphanages, trying to trace the path Helen had taken to get to the present. Each new clue he found fueled his determination. However, what troubled him most were the lingering doubts about Michael, his brother-in-law, and his possible involvement in Aurora's death. One evening, Alfred decided to invite Helen to dinner at a quiet restaurant, away from curious eyes. He wanted to thank her for her dedication to work and, at the same time, have the opportunity to get to know her better. Helen accepted the invitation, a little surprised but flattered. The dinner began lightly, with conversations about everyday life and the changes Helen had experienced since accepting the job. Little by little, Alfred steered the conversation toward more personal topics. He wanted her to feel comfortable talking about her childhood and the years she spent in the orphanage. It must have been very hard growing up without a family reference, Alfred commented, observing her reaction closely. I've always admired people who can overcome that kind of challenge. Helen smiled, but there was a melancholy in her eyes. Yes, it was complicated. But you learned to get by. I always dreamed of having a family, you know, people who really cared about me. But I learned not to expect too much. Life isn't always what we want. Alfred felt a quiet pain upon hearing this. Every word from Helen seemed to reinforce the suspicion growing within him, and he wished more than ever that he could give her the family she had never had. As they dined, a sense of familiarity settled between them, as if they were somehow connected by an invisible bond. Helen couldn't understand why she felt so comfortable beside Alfred, but something in her trusted him, as if he had always been destined to be part of her life. When the evening came to an end, Alfred walked her to her car, and before saying goodbye, he told her, Helen, I don't know what the future holds for us, but I want you to know that you're not alone. I'm here for whatever you need. She smiled, touched by the sincerity in his words. Thank you, Alfred. I never thought anyone could care so much about me. It means a lot to me. Alfred watched as she walked away, feeling that, for the first time in a long time, a thread of hope was emerging from the darkness of his memories. He knew the journey was only beginning and that he would still have to face many challenges to uncover the truth about Helen and what had really happened to Aurora. But at that moment, he was willing to risk everything for the answers he so desperately sought. Days turned into a more comfortable routine for Helen and Alfred. But what was routine for her was an unceasing quest for him. As they worked side by side, Alfred took every opportunity to gather information and look for clues about Helen's past. At the same time, the bond they had built deepened, and Alfred couldn't help but feel a growing sense of protection toward her. One afternoon, after a long meeting, Alfred received a call from the private detective he had hired to investigate Helen's origins. The call was brief, but what the detective revealed made Alfred feel as though the ground had disappeared from beneath his feet. "I found records of an incomplete adoption in the orphanage where Helen was registered. There are details that match the time of Aurora's disappearance, and if the information is correct, there's a high probability that she is your biological daughter," the detective said. Alfred clenched the phone tightly, as if he could absorb every word the detective was saying. The confirmation he had been seeking seemed within reach, but there was still one piece of the puzzle that didn't fit: Michael's role in all of this. His doubts about his brother-in-law grew stronger, especially after finding Aurora's letter that suggested distrust toward him. That same day, Alfred decided to confront Michael. He called his brother-in-law, who, though reluctant, agreed to meet him at a discreet restaurant in the city center. During the conversation, Alfred tried to subtly bring up the letter that Aurora had left before she disappeared. Aurora seemed worried. She mentioned feeling that something was wrong and that she no longer trusted you like before, Alfred said, studying each reaction from his brother-in-law. Michael shifted in his chair, the smile fading from his face. "Alfred, it's been so long. Why bring up these painful memories? Aurora is gone, and we need to move on," Michael said, trying to divert the conversation. "I know some things are hard to move past, Michael, but there are too many unanswered questions." As they continued to eat, a sense of familiarity settled between them, as if they were somehow connected by an invisible bond. Helen couldn't understand why she felt so comfortable beside Alfred, but something within her trusted him, as if he had always been destined to be part of her life. When the evening came to an end, Alfred walked her to her car, and before saying goodbye, he told her, "Helen, I don't know what the future holds for us, but I want you to know that you're not alone. I'm here for whatever you need." She smiled, touched by the sincerity in his words. "Thank you, Alfred. I never thought anyone could care so much about me. It means a lot to me." Alfred watched as Helen walked away, feeling that, for the first time in a long time, a thread of hope was beginning to emerge from the darkness of his memories. He knew the journey was just beginning and that he would still face many challenges to uncover the truth about Helen and what had really happened to Aurora. But in that moment, he was willing to risk everything for the answers he had sought for so long. In the days that followed, Helen and Alfred's routine became more comfortable. But what felt like routine to her was an unrelenting quest for him. As they worked side by side, Alfred seized every opportunity to gather information and search for clues about Helen's past. At the same time, the bond they had built deepened, and Alfred couldn't help but feel a growing sense of protection toward her. One afternoon, after a long meeting, Alfred received a call from the private detective he had hired to investigate Helen's origins. The call was brief, but what the detective revealed made Alfred feel as though the ground had disappeared from beneath his feet. "I found records of an incomplete adoption in the orphanage where Helen was registered. There are details that match the period of Aurora's disappearance, and if the information is correct, there's a high probability that she is your biological daughter." Alfred clenched the phone tightly, as if he could absorb every word from the detective. The confirmation he had been seeking seemed within his grasp, but there was still one piece of the puzzle that didn't fit: Michael's role in all this. His doubts about his brother-in-law grew stronger, especially after finding Aurora's letter that suggested mistrust toward him. That same day, Alfred decided to confront Michael. He called him, and though reluctant, Michael agreed to meet him at a discreet restaurant in the city center. During the conversation, Alfred subtly tried to mention the letter Aurora had left before disappearing. It seemed she was worried. She mentioned feeling that something was wrong and that she no longer trusted you like before. Michael shifted in his chair, the smile fading from his face. Alfred, so many years have passed. Why bring up these painful memories? Aurora is gone, and we need to move on, he said, knowing perfectly well that some things were hard to overcome. Alfred looked at him intently, as if trying to pierce through the calm facade Michael wore. I just want to understand what happened better. I think there are things that weren't said back then. Michael sighed, feigning impatience. You've always been like this, Alfred, thinking there was something hidden around every corner. Maybe it's time to accept that not all questions have answers. Alfred bit his tongue to avoid responding more aggressively, but inside, he felt that Michael was hiding something. The coldness with which he addressed the topic only fueled his suspicions. He knew he couldn't trust him, but he also knew he couldn't act hastily. A wrong move could put Helen at risk. While Alfred was busy with his investigations, Helen noticed that he was becoming increasingly distant, immersed in his own thoughts. She wondered what might be going on but respected his space, believing it was related to work matters. However, the feeling that something deeper was looming over them didn't leave her at peace. That night, after the meeting with Michael, Alfred returned home with a heavy mind. He decided to reread Aurora's letter, looking for details he might have missed. Every line written in his wife's handwriting seemed to take on new meaning, especially when she mentioned the fear she felt toward Michael. Alfred began to realize that the relationship between the siblings might have been more complex than he'd imagined. Suddenly, in the middle of all the papers he was reviewing, Alfred found an old notebook of Aurora's. Flipping through the yellowed pages, he found a loose note describing a strange encounter she'd had with Michael shortly before disappearing. Aurora mentioned that he seemed to be pressuring her about the family assets and had suggested she sign some documents to secure the baby's future. This made Alfred's head spin. He didn't remember anything like that, and Aurora had never told him that Michael was involved in decisions about their child's future. The discovery finally made Alfred admit to himself that Michael knew more than he let on and could have been directly involved in Aurora's disappearance and the baby's. With his heart racing, he decided it was time to search for more direct answers. His closeness with Helen only increased his desire to protect the young woman and ensure she wouldn't suffer any further from the secrets of the past. Meanwhile, at the office, Helen found an old photo of Aurora and Michael together in an album that Alfred had left on the table. The image showed them both smiling, but something in Michael's expression looked strange, uncomfortable. She noticed that Alfred had underlined some passages in the letter he had left out, as if he was trying to unravel a mystery. Curiosity gnawed at her, but she knew it wasn't her place to ask questions. When Alfred returned to the office the next day, he found Helen holding the photo. She seemed confused but didn't ask direct questions. Alfred, I found this photo here. You and your wife seemed very close to her family, didn't you? Helen asked cautiously. Alfred took a deep breath, trying to decide how much he should reveal. Yes, that's true. But there are many things I didn't understand at the time, things that are only now making sense after so many years. He took the photo from Helen's hands, trying to remain calm. Sometimes we need to go back to the past to understand the present, Helen commented, showing a willingness to help in whatever way was needed. Alfred, if you need help with anything, I'm here. You can count on me. The sincerity in her voice made Alfred's heart ache, reinforcing his decision to protect her at all costs. When Alfred returned to the office the next day, he found Helen holding the photo in her hands. She looked confused but didn't ask any direct questions. Alfred, I found this photo here. You and your wife seemed very close to her family, didn't you? Helen asked cautiously. Alfred took a deep breath, trying to decide how much he should reveal. Yes, that's true. But there were many things I didn't understand at the time, things that only now, after so many years, are beginning to make sense. He took the photo from Helen's hands, trying to remain calm. Sometimes we need to look back at the past to understand the present, Helen commented, showing a willingness to help however necessary. Alfred, if you need help with anything, I'm here. You can count on me. The sincerity in her voice made Alfred's heart ache, reinforcing his decision to protect her at any cost. As Helen left the room, Alfred resumed studying the photo and Aurora's notes. He knew he was close to uncovering something important, something that could change the lives of everyone around him. However, he also knew that the closer he got to the truth, the more dangerous the path became. Confronting Michael and the secrets he was hiding would require careful preparation for the potential consequences. The next morning, Alfred woke up with a heavy feeling in his chest, sensing that events were about to take an irreversible turn. The discoveries about Michael and the evidence he had gathered thus far had become impossible to ignore. He knew he needed to confront his brother-in-law more directly and extract the truth that had been hidden for so long. At the same time, he understood he had to be cautious. Any mistake could put Helen in danger, and that was something he was unwilling to allow. When he arrived at the office, he found Helen already working on some reports, one of her new responsibilities. She seemed focused, and Alfred felt a wave of guilt as he realized how many secrets he was keeping from her. But he knew there was no other way. He needed to act alone until he was absolutely sure of every detail. That afternoon, Alfred decided to invite Michael to a meeting at his home, a more private setting away from prying eyes. Michael accepted the invitation, but Alfred noticed that his brother-in-law arrived with a suspicious demeanor. Deep down, Michael knew Alfred was digging up things that should have stayed buried. As they sat in Alfred's study, the usual formalities quickly fell away. Michael, always skillful with words and calculating in his gaze, asked a direct question, as if he wanted to end the situation quickly. "So, Alfred, what do you really want to talk about?" "I imagine this isn't just about business," Michael said, his tone heavy with tension. Alfred took a deep breath before responding. "Michael, do you remember the last days before Aurora disappeared?" He paused, studying each reaction from his brother-in-law. "I found some letters from her, something she left behind, and it's strange. She mentioned you several times, as if she were afraid or worried." Michael kept an impassive expression, but Alfred noticed how his fingers tightened on the leather armrest of the chair. "I don't know what you're talking about, Alfred. Aurora's death was a tragedy, and digging up these stories now won't change anything." But Alfred wasn't willing to accept Michael's evasions. He leaned over the table, his hands firmly on the papers he had brought with him. "And what if I told you I found records of a baby? One who was placed in an orphanage shortly after Aurora's disappearance. And what if I told you everything points to that baby being hidden so no one would know of their existence? What would you say then?" This time, Michael couldn't hide the panic that crossed his face. He swallowed, trying to regain control of the conversation. "You're making things up, Alfred. I have nothing to do with this. I don't know what you think you're going to find, but you're deceiving yourself." "Deceiving myself?" Alfred replied, raising his voice. "Then why did Aurora leave a letter saying she no longer trusted you? Why did she write that she was scared and that you pressured her to sign documents? You manipulated her. You wanted control of the business, no matter who you hurt in the process." Michael stood up from his chair, visibly irritated, but his anger was just a mask to hide his nervousness. "You're crossing a line, Alfred. If you keep making these insinuations, I won't stand idly by." Alfred stood up as well, his contained anger pouring into his words. "You were responsible for Aurora's disappearance and for how everything unfolded. And I know you hid the baby. Don't worry, Michael, I'm going to uncover the whole truth, and you will pay for what you did." Realizing that Alfred wasn't willing to back down, Michael attempted a change in strategy, adopting a threatening tone. "Be careful, Alfred. Sometimes, digging into the past can bring consequences you're not prepared to face. Leave this behind while you still have the chance." But Michael's words only reinforced Alfred's determination. He realized his brother-in-law was trying to buy time, and that only confirmed his suspicions. Michael was desperate to keep the secrets of the past buried. And Alfred knew that this desperation was a sign he was on the right path. After Michael left, Alfred felt a mixture of triumph and apprehension. He knew he had provoked a reaction in his brother-in-law, but he also knew he had to act quickly. He returned to the office, where Helen was still working, unaware that her life was in danger. She smiled when she saw him enter, without any idea of the intensity of the thoughts racing through Alfred's mind. "Alfred, is everything all right?" Helen asked, noticing the tension in his expression. Alfred tried to disguise it, but his voice came out heavier than he expected. "Everything's fine, Helen. It's just complicated matters, but nothing you need to worry about, I promise." Though suspicious, Helen chose not to press him. However, as she returned home that night, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with Alfred's behavior. He was more distant than usual, and the tension in the air seemed almost palpable. Meanwhile, Michael was driving home, his hands trembling on the steering wheel. He knew Alfred was closer to the truth than he liked, and it filled him with panic. For the first time in years, he felt his actions beginning to turn against him, threatening to destroy everything he had built. That same night, Alfred received a call from the detective with information that confirmed his suspicions. Helen had been registered at an orphanage just a few months after Aurora's disappearance. There was no longer any doubt, Helen was his daughter, the child he thought he had lost forever. Now, more than ever, he needed to protect her from Michael. What Alfred didn't know was that Michael also had a plan in mind. The brother-in-law wasn't willing to let his secrets be exposed, and he knew the only way to silence both Alfred and Helen was to eliminate the threat. To him, the young woman who had become the center of Alfred's investigations was the piece that had to be removed. The tension between Alfred and Michael grew visibly after their direct confrontation. Alfred, now more determined than ever, prepared to gather all the necessary evidence and expose what had happened to Aurora, as well as reveal the truth to Helen. He knew this revelation would forever change her life, but he firmly believed that the truth, no matter how painful, was better than living in the midst of lies. One morning, Alfred met with the private detective to discuss the next steps. They analyzed the documents connecting Helen to the orphanage and the date of her registration, which perfectly matched the time of Aurora's disappearance. The detective suggested they conduct a DNA test to officially confirm the bond between Alfred and Helen, and Alfred agreed. He didn't want to leave any doubt for Helen or himself. Deep down, though, he already knew what the result would be. Meanwhile, Helen continued with her usual routine, unaware that her world was about to collapse. She was worried about Alfred, who had become even more reserved and agitated in recent days, but she chose not to question him too much, respecting his space. That afternoon, Alfred asked Helen to leave the office early, telling her he had something he needed to handle alone. Helen accepted, a little surprised, but believing it was a business matter. As she walked home, she couldn't shake a feeling of unease, as if a dark premonition was hanging over her. She tried to distract herself by listening to music while walking along the quiet streets of Los Angeles, but the feeling that something was wrong wouldn't leave her. When she reached her apartment door, a man she didn't know approached quickly, grabbing her arm tightly. "You're coming with me. Don't ask questions and don't scream, or I'll hurt you," he said in a menacing tone. Helen tried to pull away, but the man was too strong. He pushed her toward a car waiting on the corner, and before she could understand what was happening, she was being taken far from everything she knew. At the office, Alfred was trying to focus on organizing the documents he would use to confront Michael. He didn't know that, at that exact moment, Helen's life was in danger. When he received a call from an unknown number, he thought it might be the detective with an update, but the voice he heard on the other end was cold and filled with malice. "Alfred, I hope you're comfortable. I just wanted you to know that your precious assistant is in my hands. If you want her to stay alive, you'll stop asking questions and forget everything you've discovered about Aurora and the baby. Otherwise, the next time you see her will be in a coffin." La sangre de Humberto se congeló al escuchar esas palabras. Reconoció la voz de Mariano al otro lado de la línea, pero lo que más lo aterrorizó fue el sonido ahogado de Lucía llorando en el fondo. La amenaza era real, y por primera vez en muchos años, Humberto sintió un miedo genuino, no por sí mismo, sino por Lucía, quien ahora se había convertido en un peón en el peligroso juego de Mariano. Mariano, no hagas esto. Ella no tiene nada que ver con lo que pasó entre nosotros, con lo que pasó con Aurora. Déjala ir, podemos resolver esto entre nosotros, de hombre a hombre, suplicó Humberto, tratando de mantener su voz firme, aunque la angustia era evidente en sus palabras. Ah, ya tuviste tu oportunidad, Humberto. Y ahora es demasiado tarde. La única manera de que Lucía salga de esto es que renuncies a esta investigación y dejes de intentar exponerme. Estoy al mando aquí, y si intentas algo, pagarás un precio muy alto, respondió Mariano, antes de colgar el teléfono, dejando a Humberto solo con el peso de su decisión. Desesperado, Humberto cayó de rodillas en medio de su sala de estar, intentando asimilar lo que acababa de escuchar. Se sentía impotente, incapaz de proteger a Lucía, la última conexión viva que tenía con Aurora. Pero en el fondo sabía que no podía ceder al chantaje de Mariano. Si lo hacía, Lucía seguiría en peligro, y la memoria de Aurora nunca encontraría justicia. Humberto volvió a tomar el teléfono y llamó al detective, explicándole la situación entre palabras aceleradas y ahogadas. Se llevaron a Lucía. Está en manos de Mariano. Tenemos que actuar rápido. Descubre dónde la tiene. No podemos dejar que se salga con la suya. El detective, aunque alarmado, prometió actuar con rapidez, movilizando a sus contactos y a la policía para comenzar la búsqueda de Mariano y sus secuaces. Humberto sabía que cada segundo contaba, y la sensación de urgencia le apretaba el pecho. Estaba dispuesto a arriesgarlo todo para salvar a Lucía, incluso si eso significaba poner en peligro su propia vida. Mientras tanto, Lucía intentaba mantener la calma en el escondite improvisado donde Mariano la había encerrado. Estaba atada a una silla, con los ojos vendados, pero su mente estaba alerta, intentando comprender lo que estaba sucediendo. Mariano, vigilándola de cerca, paseaba nerviosamente por la habitación, manteniendo el teléfono en la mano, esperando una respuesta de Humberto que no llegaba. Con cada minuto que pasaba, la tensión aumentaba, y la desesperación comenzaba a notarse en su voz. ¿De verdad crees que arriesgará su vida por un secreto del pasado?, dijo Mariano, su voz cargada de sarcasmo. Los hombres como Humberto solo piensan en sí mismos. Te abandonará en cuanto se dé cuenta de que no vale la pena luchar por ti. Lucía intentaba ignorar las provocaciones, pero las palabras de Mariano la afectaban. No sabía qué pensar de todo esto, pero en el fondo, quería creer que Humberto vendría a rescatarla. Mientras tanto, Humberto condujo a toda velocidad por la carretera, intentando mantener el control del coche en las curvas resbaladizas debido a la lluvia. Ya veía las luces de los coches policiales más adelante, lo que le dio un poco de alivio al saber que no estaba solo en esta búsqueda. Cuando llegó al lugar, fue recibido por uno de los oficiales que coordinaban la operación. Señor Vasconos, necesitamos ser cuidadosos. Tenemos información de que Mariano está armado y que la rehén está dentro de la cabaña. Nuestra prioridad es garantizar la seguridad de todos, especialmente de la joven. Humberto miró la cabaña entre los árboles, con la mente fija en la idea de que Lucía estaba allí, a solo unos metros de distancia, pero aún en gran peligro. Hagan lo que sea necesario, pero tenemos que sacarla de allí con vida. Cooperaré en todo lo que sea necesario, respondió con firmeza. La policía comenzó a posicionarse alrededor de la cabaña, intentando establecer contacto con Mariano para negociar su rendición. Dentro de la cabaña, Mariano recibió las instrucciones a través de un altavoz, su expresión de desesperación creciendo con cada palabra. Mariano, sabemos que estás allí con Lucía. Sal pacíficamente y garantizaremos tu integridad, le dijeron. Pero Mariano, acorralado y sin alternativas, decidió recurrir a la desesperación. Jaló a Lucía por el brazo, colocándola frente a la ventana de la cabaña con un arma apuntando a su cabeza. Si alguien intenta algo, ella muere ahora mismo, gritó, haciendo que todos los oficiales a su alrededor se detuvieran. Humberto, al ver la escena, sintió un escalofrío recorrerle. Mariano soltó una risa amarga, llena de desdén. ¿De verdad crees que voy a creerte, Humberto? Siempre fuiste un iluso, pero sé que no cederías tan fácilmente. No, voy a salir de aquí a mi manera, y si tengo que llevarme a alguien conmigo, será a Lucía. Lucía sintió las manos temblorosas de Mariano mientras la sujetaba, y supo que la situación estaba a punto de salirse de control. Recordó las palabras de Humberto, las promesas que le había hecho de que nunca estaría sola otra vez, y decidió arriesgarse. Con un movimiento rápido, intentó liberarse de Mariano, empujándolo hacia un lado y gritando con todas las fuerzas que le quedaban. La distracción fue suficiente para que la policía avanzara hacia la cabaña. En un movimiento coordinado, lograron desarmar a Mariano e inmovilizarlo en el suelo. Lucía, aún asustada y jadeando, fue llevada afuera por uno de los oficiales, mientras Humberto corría hacia ella, ignorando todas las órdenes de mantenerse atrás. Cuando finalmente llegó a su lado, Humberto la abrazó con fuerza, sintiendo que el alivio lo envolvía al darse cuenta de que estaba a salvo. Lucía, todavía temblorosa, correspondió al abrazo, sintiéndose segura por primera vez desde que había sido secuestrada. No comprendía todo lo que estaba ocurriendo, pero sabía que Humberto había arriesgado todo por salvarla. Estoy aquí, Lucía. Te prometo que no dejaré que nada más te pase, susurró Humberto con la voz ahogada por la emoción. Sabía que había muchas cosas que decir, muchas verdades que aún debían ser reveladas, pero en ese momento, lo único que importaba era que ella estaba a salvo, en sus brazos. Mariano, esposado y furioso, observaba la escena con amargura, sabiendo que su juego había terminado. Los secretos que había intentado ocultar durante tantos años estaban a punto de salir a la luz, y no había escapatoria. Mientras la policía lo escoltaba fuera de la cabaña, Mariano lanzó una última mirada a Humberto, llena de odio y resentimiento, como si prometiera que este no sería el final. Pero para Humberto y Lucía, ese momento marcaba el comienzo de una nueva etapa. Sabían que, aunque Lucía había sido rescatada, todavía quedaba un largo camino por delante. Humberto tenía que enfrentar las consecuencias del pasado, contarle la verdad a Lucía, y juntos, reconstruir lo que quedaba de sus vidas. De vuelta en su oficina, horas más tarde, Humberto y Lucía se sentaron frente a la chimenea, que iluminaba suavemente la habitación. Lucía lo observaba, esperando respuestas, mientras él reunía el valor para revelar el secreto que había estado guardando. Lucía, comenzó Humberto con voz seria, pero llena de afecto. Todo lo que ha pasado en los últimos días tiene que ver con el pasado, con algo que nunca pensé que tendría que enfrentar. Y aunque quería protegerte, la verdad es que tú eres parte de ese pasado, parte de un secreto que estuvo enterrado durante mucho tiempo. Lucía frunció el ceño, confusa, tratando de entender lo que Humberto estaba diciendo. ¿Qué tengo yo que ver con esto, Humberto? ¿Por qué Mariano me odiaba tanto? ¿Y por qué arriesgaste tanto para salvarme? Humberto suspiró profundamente, pasándose las manos por la cara, como si buscara las palabras adecuadas. Porque, Lucía, no eres solo mi asistente. Eres mucho más que eso. Tú eres mi hija. El impacto en los ojos de Lucía fue inmediato. Se echó hacia atrás en la silla, incapaz de creer lo que acababa de escuchar. ¿Tu hija? ¿Cómo es eso posible? Yo fui criada en un orfanato. Nunca supe nada de mis padres biológicos. ¿Cómo podría ser tu hija? Humberto se acercó, con los ojos llenos de emoción. Hace 20 años, mi esposa Aurora estaba embarazada cuando desapareció. La encontraron muerta, y todo este tiempo creí que había perdido tanto a ella como al bebé que llevaba. Pero hace poco comencé a encontrar pistas, cartas antiguas, documentos, y me di cuenta de que había mucho más detrás de lo que sabía. Hizo una pausa, intentando contener las lágrimas. Mariano, mi cuñado, fue el responsable de todo. Planeó la desaparición de Aurora y ocultó a la niña, te ocultó a ti, Lucía. Te llevó a un orfanato para que nadie descubriera que existías, para poder tomar el control de los negocios familiares. Y ahora, cuando comencé a investigar, trató de deshacerse de ti para proteger su secreto. Lucía sintió como si el suelo se desmoronara bajo sus pies. Su cabeza daba vueltas con toda la información, y le tomó unos minutos procesar todo lo que Humberto. Entonces, ¿quieres decir que tú eres mi padre?, preguntó con la voz temblorosa, como si esperara que todo fuera un mal sueño. ¿Y Aurora, la mujer de la foto, era mi madre? Humberto sostuvo las manos de Lucía con afecto, sus ojos brillando con el dolor y la esperanza de un reencuentro largamente esperado. Sí, Lucía. Y lo siento mucho por todo lo que has pasado, por no haber podido protegerte ni a ti ni a tu madre. Pero estoy aquí ahora, y quiero recuperar el tiempo perdido, si me das una oportunidad. Lucía lo miró, todavía tratando de asimilar la verdad que había cambiado completamente su vida. Por un lado, sentía rabia y tristeza por todo lo que le habían arrebatado. Pero también sentía un profundo alivio por finalmente saber de dónde venía. Mirando a los ojos de Humberto, se dio cuenta de que él también había sufrido en silencio durante todos esos años, y que llevaba la carga de su pérdida. Con un suspiro entrecortado, Lucía sintió, por primera vez en mucho tiempo, que estaba en el lugar al que pertenecía. No sé cómo sentirme sobre todo esto, Humberto, pero si estás dispuesto a intentarlo, yo también lo estoy, dijo, con una pequeña sonrisa tímida en su rostro. Humberto la abrazó nuevamente, estrechándola con fuerza, como si intentara compensar 2 décadas de ausencia. Gracias, Lucía. Haré todo lo posible para que sientas que nunca más estarás sola. Esa noche, padre e hija se sentaron juntos, hablando del pasado, de Aurora y de lo que el futuro podría traerles. Humberto sabía que todavía tendrían que enfrentarse a las consecuencias de las acciones de Mariano, pero también sabía que, por primera vez en mucho tiempo, había una esperanza real para ellos. La paz que ambos encontraron en ese momento les permitió soñar con un futuro juntos, sabiendo que, aunque el camino no sería fácil, lo enfrentarían lado a lado. Las cicatrices del pasado comenzarían a sanar, y Humberto, por fin, había recuperado lo más importante, la posibilidad de una vida con su hija, Lucía. Have to rebuild what remained of their lives. Back in his office hours later, Alfred and Helen sat by the fireplace, which cast a warm glow over the room. Helen watched him, waiting for answers, while he gathered the courage to reveal the secret he had been holding back. Helen, Alfred began, his voice serious but filled with affection. Everything that's happened in recent days has to do with the past, with something I never thought I would have to confront. And although I wanted to protect you, the truth is, you're part of that past, part of a secret that's been buried for a long time. Helen frowned, confused, trying to make sense of what Alfred was saying. What do I have to do with this, Alfred? Why did Michael hate me so much? And why did you risk so much to save me? Alfred sighed deeply, running his hands over his face as if searching for the right words. Because, Helen, you're not just my assistant. You're much more than that. You're my daughter. The impact on Helen's face was immediate. She leaned back in her chair, unable to believe what she had just heard. Your daughter? How is that possible? I grew up in an orphanage. I never knew anything about my biological parents. How could I be your daughter? Alfred leaned closer, his eyes filled with emotion. 20 years ago, my wife, Aurora, was pregnant when she disappeared. They found her dead, and all this time I believed I had lost both her and the baby she was carrying. But recently, I began finding clues, old letters, documents, and I realized there was much more to the story than I knew. He paused, struggling to hold back tears. Michael, my brother-in-law, was responsible for everything. He planned Aurora's disappearance and hid the child. He hid you, Helen. He took you to an orphanage so that no one would discover your existence, so he could take control of the family business. And now, when I started investigating, he tried to get rid of you to protect his secret. Helen felt as though the ground had fallen away beneath her feet. Her head was spinning with all this information, and it took her a few minutes to process everything Alfred had told her. Tears streamed down her face as she tried to piece together this cruel puzzle. So, you're saying, you're my father? She asked, her voice trembling, as if hoping it was all a bad dream. And Aurora, the woman in the photo, she was my mother. Alfred held Helen's hands with affection, his eyes shining with the pain and hope of a long-awaited reunion. Yes, Helen. And I'm so sorry for everything you've gone through, for not being able to protect you or your mother. But I'm here now, and I want to make up for the lost time, if you'll give me a chance. Helen looked at him, still trying to process the truth that had completely changed her life. She felt anger and sadness for everything that had been taken from her. But she also felt an overwhelming relief in finally knowing where she came from. Looking into Alfred's eyes, she realized that he, too, had silently suffered for all those years, carrying the weight of his loss. With a shaky sigh, Helen felt, for the first time in a long while, that she was where she belonged. I don't know how I feel about all this, Alfred, but if you're willing to try, then so am I, she said, with a small, shy smile on her face. Alfred hugged her again, holding her tightly, as if trying to make up for 2 decades of absence. Thank you, Helen. I'll do everything I can to make you feel like you're never alone again. That night, father and daughter sat together, talking about the past, about Aurora, and what the future might bring them. Alfred knew they would still have to face the consequences of Michael's actions, but he also knew that, for the first time in a long time, there was real hope for them. The peace they found in that moment allowed them to dream of a future together, knowing that, although the road ahead would not be easy, they would face it side by side. The scars of the past would begin to heal, and Alfred had finally regained the most important thing, the chance for a life with his daughter, Helen.